Welcome. So this is the Food and Agriculture Community Call, and we're going to have a presentation for part of it and a discussion for part of it. And so for now, it'll just be Larry and myself speaking, and then we'll open it up for discussion at the end. So this is just a quick reminder of the vision and purpose and goals that this community has kind of been working on over the past year and beyond. But here's where we're at now. We're trying to, as a community, think about how do we help gardens have the capacity and networks to contribute to critical food literacy. And then we want to provide a forum where garden professionals can explore and collaborate on various aspects of agriculture and food systems. And then we identified some goal areas, which I won't read through all of them, but they're up there. And as we kind of have had conversations around these goals, we've thought about how do we take some action on some of these areas. And so I think today's call and going forward, some of the activities that we'll do are going to touch on all of these goals. But particularly today, we want to look at goal 2 and think about advancing and sharing education around food and agriculture. And then we want to connect ourselves with one another and with leaders in the food and agriculture sector. So we're going to be focusing kind of in those areas today, and be interested to get some feedback on other things that people want to see going forward with this community. So that's a conversation that can continue to go on both online, in person when we see each other. And this is just a quick reminder of the vision and purpose and goals that this community has kind of been working on over the past year and beyond. But here's where we're at now. We're trying to, as a community, think about how do we help gardens have the capacity and networks to contribute to critical food literacy. And then we want to provide a forum where garden professionals can explore and collaborate on various aspects of agriculture and food systems. And then we identified some goal areas, which I won't read through all of them, but they're up there. And as we kind of have had conversations around these goals, we've thought about how do we take some action on some of these areas. And so I think today's call and going forward, some of the activities that we'll do are going to touch on all of these goals. But particularly today, we want to look at goal 2 and think about advancing and sharing education around food and agriculture. And then we want to connect ourselves with one another and with leaders in the food and agriculture sector. So we're going to be focusing kind of in those areas today, and be interested to get some feedback on other things that people want to see going forward with this community. So that's a conversation that can continue to go on both online, in person when we see each other. And this is an evolving thing, and our goals are evolving. And so we really want to keep that conversation open and have people thinking about what's going to best meet the needs of this community. So one thing that we talked about at last year's APGA conference, for those who were able to attend our community meeting, was this idea of doing some working groups within the community. And we came up with a few ideas of areas that people wanted to explore. And one was urban agriculture and one was soils. And so Larry and I kind of agreed to spearhead those. And as we talked, we decided, why don't we start out by sort of collaborating on this? We think that together we could come up with some activities and sort of educational initiatives that can help sort of move ideas forward for this community and help us all learn together some more. And so we came up with this idea of at least for now and for this year, looking at developing a healthy soils initiative within this community. And what we'd like to do is just facilitate knowledge sharing, both amongst ourselves in public gardens and with the scientific community, on how we can best produce nutrient-dense crops in healthy and sustainably managed soils. And so you can imagine a lot of different areas that we could explore within this Healthy Soils initiative. And some of the activities that Larry and I have talked about are activities like this one, doing soils-focused education within our own community and at APGA at the conference, promoting knowledge sharing online with our online discussion group, thinking about maybe in the future having a convening where we focus on soils. And then we'd be really interested in, what people are interested in learning and doing together as a community around this issue of healthy soils. So if you have ideas, you can share those at the end of this call when we have our conversation, or you can always email me or Larry as we think about sort of how we want to move this forward. So that's kind of to ground us in what we're going to get into today. And I'll turn it over at this point to Phil Cordelli and Larry Vickerman from Denver Botanic Gardens Chatfield Farms. And they're going to speak to us a bit about the work they've been doing at Denver Botanic Gardens Chatfield Farms around soil health. And with that, I will turn it over to Larry and Phil.
Oh, thanks, Emily. And I just want to say a word about Phil Cordelli. He's our community supported agriculture grower and manager, and he's been with us for 7 years. And Phil is a very creative farmer that's always looking for new and varied ways to do things. So I commend him for bearing with me on this whole process. And I grew up on a farm and a ranch, always been interested in soil and soil fertility. And I've always been concerned about modern farming and how it treated soil basically as some kind of artificial medium that's there to deliver a mixture of chemicals and nutrients via the root system and to hold crops up. About 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Christine Jones. She is a soil scientist from Australia. And her approach was completely different than anything I've ever heard. She actually had helped confirm that there was a symbiotic relationship between soil microbiology and plant roots. What a concept, huh? And so I studied her work intensively and found numerous others. And Phil had a lot of experience growing organic. And so we kind of put our heads together. And this past year, Phil's been working with cover cropping and intercropping for a number of years. But this last year, we really started to put it together and started to do some really interesting new things. And I'm going to give you the idealized version, and Phil's going to give you the real world version, that how it happens out in the field. And I think that's a great perspective. Just a couple of background things. Dr. David Montgomery, University of Washington, has written several books on soils and how they are responsible for civilizations either thriving or eventually going extinct. And he has some interesting perspectives, and if you get a chance to read any of his books, look him up on the web. He's at University of Washington. Fascinating person. Dr. Christine Jones, she figured out this, or helped to develop the idea of the liquid carbon pathway. The roots secrete carbon, and this feeds microbes who in turn provide other nutrients out of the soil. And it's a fairly symbiotic loop that plants have relied on for millions of years, and it's something that we totally short-circuited in terms of modern farming. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is based on her work, and also a lot of work that's been done at the Rodale Institute as well. Of course, we set out years ago, because Colorado is a water-stressed state, to come up with ways to conserve and make our irrigation water go farther. You don't grow vegetables here without irrigation. We average about 16 inches of rainfall a year, and a lot of times 3 or 4 inches of that comes in a couple of big downpours. So, and of course, the first thing we did was drip irrigation. That'll save us. We save 36% of our total water use just by switching from overhead sprinkler to drip irrigation. And then Phil, when he came in, he uses a lot of remake covers to protect new seedlings and lessen evapotranspiration, and also to exclude pests as well. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of the scale, Phil manages about 7 acres of vegetables. And then we have an additional market garden, which is another 1.5 acres. And we supply a community-supported ag program and numerous market low-income farm stands in the Denver area as well with all those. So my big thing was let's build some more soil organic matter and improve our water holding capacity. We figured out how to deliver the water, but let's improve our water holding capacity. I know for folks back east where rainfall and waterlogged soils are a problem, might go, why would you want to do that? Here, though, it's a big thing to be able to increase that organic matter and hold on to that water, make it more root available over the long term. I ran into a succession of studies from the Morrow plots down at the University of Illinois, and these are plots that were established in 1876. It's the longest running continuous farm experiment. And they published extensive papers in 2006, 2007 that revealed that inorganic, that's synthetic and inputs, severely deplete soil carbon, impair soil water holding capacity, and also deplete available N in the soil itself. So it seemed a bit counterproductive from what I read in these papers. As I said, the papers came out in 2006, 2007, and the silence was deafening from the agricultural crowd. It's like, so, anyway. Ratan Lal at Ohio State University, he has documented that cultivated soils around the world have lost between 50 and 70% of their original carbon content, which is kind of amazing considering soil is the second largest carbon sink on Earth behind the oceans. And I think we all know what's going on with the oceans. They're about to capacity. And so a lot of folks involved with climate mitigation are looking at soil and being able to incorporate carbon back into soils. And carbon in soils is simply organic matter. And it's stockpiled long-term fertility, if you want to look at it in a real simplistic way. So another thing that Phil taught me this, I always said, oh, things are struggling a little bit, put a little synthetic NPK on it, everything's good. And Phil looked like that. He looked at me like I was a little bit crazy about all that. He's always used organic forms of fertilizers. So, but the studies, and this came out of the Morrow plots as well, applying synthetic NPK fertilizer shuts down soil production of nitrogen, and that's through microbial action, and slows down or even halts humus formation. Thus why we have very low carbon stocks in cultivated soils around the world because of especially nitrogen fertilization. The other problem is nitrogen volatilizes and reacts with ozone, number one, which it's also NO2 is a pretty potent greenhouse gas. And the other issue is pretty much 40 to 90% of all N applied, synthetic N applied to farm soils ends up in the local water supply, which was really kind of a shocking thing to me. I knew it was very water soluble, but I didn't realize how much was getting away from us. And then, of course, soil's low in organic matter resist water infiltration and storage of water as well. So, there's a pile of our compost, or picture of our compost piles, and yes, compost is the answer. There's only one big problem with it. It's bulky and heavy and hard to move around, but a lot of different issues. So, going back to a study, Dr. Wendy Silver at UC Berkeley, which isn't too far from you, Filoli folks. And Dr. Silver is a fascinating person. I've talked to her extensively about her research. She did she's been doing carbon sequestration experiments in central and coastal California for a number of years. And she found that by putting on just a ½ inch of compost on old pastures in California, she can sequester an additional 900 pounds of carbon. And basically that compost is an inoculant to really stir up the microbial life and add microbial life, which can help sequester that carbon. And then the other thing was, which is fascinating to us in Colorado, is the compost improved grass growth 25–50%, which we knew, but it also improved water retention on average at 2,800 gallons per acre. When you only get 16 inches of rainfall a year, 2,800 gallons is a lot of water to be saving in the soil profile. So, and I'm going to ask Phil to jump in here anytime he wants because he's the real pro on some of this. But composting and cover cropping has raised our soil organic matters from about 1.5% to 3.5% to 4%. And Phil has figured out ways to get clover to grow between crops. He used cover cropping extensively. Anything you want to say about that, Phil?
Yeah, just that we, as Larry mentioned, we did 2.5 of our 7 acres in no-till this season. We had been looking at ways of minimizing tillage for a number of years, including that mammoth red clover there in all our aisles. And one of the big things was the water savings in terms of having a mulch on top of the soil at as much as possible. We saw a huge amount of water savings between beds that we did rototilled and bare ground versus beds next to which we did in the no-till system. Huge amount of water savings there.
So the other thing that compost is, as I mentioned, it helps build those populations of bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, arthropods, you name it. And this microbial activity drives the process of aggregation and enhancing soil structure. And Phil's mentioned to me several times that these cover cropped soils are totally aggregated differently. They hold water much tighter, much differently as well, and they're able to absorb a lot, just like he said. And then some carbon fixed by plants during photosynthesis is exuded by the roots to feed soil microbes, and that's kind of liquid carbon, or glomalin is another name for the whole pathway that goes on in those particular instances. This is one of Christine Jones's principles is keep live plants growing in the ground as much as possible. And it's a real challenge for Phil here in Colorado because of we already had snow and 9 degrees just the other day. But the cover crops, he's figured out how to keep them going between rows. And then also he's really getting great at establishing them over the rows themselves as soon as the crop comes out. And just to keep those root exudates going as much as possible until the soil freezes here.
Yeah, I really got tired of sitting in my office over the winter and watching the winds just blow our topsoil into dust devils out there, you know. So yeah, keeping roots, keeping plant material on top of that ground as much as possible, because when those winter and spring winds whip that dry soil around out here, you're looking at losing so much of the work you've put in, you know.
This was an interesting project that Phil spearheaded this summer, and we've trellised tomatoes before, and he established these intercrops between the rows last summer. Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to tell them a little bit about this whole project here.
Yeah, so we've been looking at a combination of cover crops. We were looking at triticale, barley, oats, those 3 grasses mixed in with field peas and vetch. That's kind of our basic mixture. Last year, we tried all those. Is the best because that was the quickest for us last year. And so basically what we try to do is get a fall crop established, let it winter kill, and then it'll spring back in the summer as soon as the soil warms up enough and we get some moisture. And then once you get that going, you can then take a crimper, or you can either mow or crimp your cover crop down and terminate it, and then come through and rip a furrow for your crop and plant into it. So the tomatoes and peppers, we knew we were pushing it a little bit. We in 2018, we were able to terminate that cover crop on June 13th. But this season, we had a pretty cold, wet spring, and we weren't able to get that cover crop to establish and grow enough to be able to terminate until June 28th. So we were pretty well delayed in planting. We still had a pretty decent year, but it did affect our yields. And so, one of the big transitions that we were making this year is, moving away from being able to just till, prep a bed and plant according to an Excel schedule, to moving to being able to, rip a furrow and plant our plants when the cover crop is ready. So kind of a pretty fundamental shift in our planting calendar, and definitely one that will take some finessing in future years.
I just wanted to add to this particular project here too that the intercrop or the in-between rows have clover and vetch in them. And what's fascinating is these tomatoes, Phil put a little bit of chicken manure in the rows as he planted, and they were transplants, of course. But that was the extent of the nitrogen input into the system. So the clover and the vetch took over and still had a really good tomato crop, just a little slower than last year. But live and learn, but there is some real advantages to using this kind of intercropping on trellis systems. Phil mentioned crimping, and in theory it works great. I think I'll let him tell you some of the drawbacks to it. It doesn't always work quite as easy as we expect, but it does provide a ground cover, and it helps make that bridge of as much of a living roots in the soil as much as possible.
Yeah, so you see that roller crimper there on the front of the tractor, and then in the back, what they're doing is planting directly into, there's some furrowers on that planter there, and then some seeders dropping seeds in behind it. Yeah, we basically what you're looking for are those cover crops to get to just after flowering stage to knock them down. When you let them get that far, all their resources are going into flowering and seed production. And when you crimp those stems on down, the plant doesn't have enough resources to regrow. At least that's the theory. So we were really experimenting. We tried a few different, we crimped some beds. I think it was at 3 or 4 day intervals. So the beds we crimped, a day or two early, the cover crop just sprang right back on up, and we had to go through and hand weed out around the plants. Some beds we hit spot on, some beds we were a little late on, and unfortunately those beds then had viable seed, which then it turned into hand weeding barley seedlings out from amidst our crop. So again, this was year one for us, so really just kind of going through all the catalog of all the mistakes you can make to learn,
So just to kind of wrap up, and we're gonna take all the questions anybody might have, but I think it's been a real learning experience for us. Some things have been surprising, like the fact that cover cropping and intercropping, even between crops, we're still seeing water savings, which I find kind of fascinating, and the whole nitrogen effect of intercropping on tomatoes. Phil has certainly made some interesting points about sometimes crimping doesn't always work quite how we expect it to, and there's always delays in terms of how the season goes. I think overall, though, the real proof is in the pudding to come. Is we're going to take a set of soil samples this fall and see what kind of changes we've seen over previous soil management treatments, and see if we can start to see some real increase in carbon content and some of those issues. I don't know, Phil, you got anything you want to add?
I will say, as regards to the educational piece, every week we do our CSA newsletter, and I like to include information about how all our growing practices. And I will say that we've had way more interest in our growing practices and questions about it, and just a general level of interest this year than any other year since we've been talking with the shareholders about the challenges and ebb and flow of the season as regards to like our new growing practices. So yeah, that's something we feel really good about, even regardless of successes or failures this year.
All right. So, any questions, concerns? Call us crazy, whatever you want to say.
Larry, thank you so much. And Phil, this has been a really wonderful talk. Actually, Larry and Phil, I have a first question to throw out to you.
Sure.
Just in terms of talking about cover crops, I know that sometimes the argument against using them is a timing issue, and different climates. Certainly I was in Iowa early this spring, and I was actually at the Corteva research plots, and I asked them why they didn't have any cover crops on their soil, and they actually were a little, they said, we really should, and we have a lot of timing issues, and there you are in Colorado, which I know is probably the most erratic weather imaginable in some cases. Do you feel like that's an excuse? I mean, is there always a way, I guess, no matter the climate? Would you answer that?
Yeah, I think we're proof that there's always a way. And sometimes some years are more successful than others, and I think it is a matter of we've really pivoted to prioritizing cover crops and our growing practices, even as much as the cash crops that we're putting out. And so I think it is just a matter of will, whether you need some overhead irrigation to get started, there's always a way. And believe me, I've been there. I've had disastrous, before we kind of made this pivot, I feel like we had a few seasons where our cover crop was really patchy, the weeds were coming on in, and we just had to mow it down. And so, yeah, I mean, you're not going to be 100% successful every time, but I think if the will is there, you can definitely do it.
I just want to add too is from following this endeavor for a number of years and the research I've done, I think there's always an advantage to cover cropping, whether that be water holding capacity, just pure organic matter incorporation. I have seen cover cropping done in Iowa on a large scale, and it's becoming more and more popular there. But we all have those challenges of right exactly when to hit it, when to terminate it. The picture, though, on this title slide kind of says it all. Phil started this cover crop the winter before, just barely got it in, got it up a little bit. The geese mowed it off because we have lots of Canada geese. And then you did a little overseeding last spring in 2019. And this is what it came on as with, you didn't irrigate this spring.
Yeah.
A little bit?
Yeah, a couple of times.
So it's possible. It's possible in all kinds of challenging ways. And the guy that runs our market garden has also used spinach as an overwinter crop too. So there's always something that you can get growing in there. Good question.
Thanks. Thank you both. Here's a question from Gabe at Phipps. Has anyone at Denver Botanic Garden used this framework in a more urban raised bed setting? If so, are there any issues translating to those settings?
No, I would say, and no, there's plenty of people here in the Denver metro area doing cover crops in raised beds. The only, obviously your equipment will change as far as how to mow it down, or how to incorporate it. We've used a seed drill out here behind a tractor on our scale, but we've also just flung it out and raked it in with decent success as well. And I feel like on a smaller scale, I feel like it's actually more helpful in terms of paying attention to these like little timing increments. For us, when we were talking about, crimping it down, I'm talking about, crimping down between 2 and 2.5 acres. But I can't think of any challenges that I've heard people talk about in terms of doing raised beds or on a real micro scale. I mean, our local seed company will make us little 5-10 pound bags of seed. So yeah, I mean, I guess maybe seed source, where you're sourcing your seeds at a small scale could be an issue, but I think a lot of places will work around that too.
I think the biggest thing out here, Gabe, is we have to, usually in the fall, we'll have to irrigate it to get it to come up at a decent time. Otherwise, we're waiting for snow and then our soil gets too cold. So probably not a problem in Pittsburgh as much, but here definitely dryness and getting that soil to germinate is the key thing. But I've used mustard cover crops on my raised beds at home that I grow bulbs in, and it works just fine. Just irrigate them, get them up, and terminate them at the right time.
Oh, by the way, Gabe says thank you.
You
That was
bet.
a great answer. I've got one other question, and this is in relation to some of the statements you made earlier on in the presentation about carbon storage in soil and the fact that synthetic fertilizer is inhibiting. I'm a little bit curious because I know at least a little later in your talk you mentioned that there's an inhibition of signaling between plant roots and microbes that is caused by the synthetic fertilizer. I'm wondering how significant that is in terms of, is that the primary reason you wouldn't use it, or do you just feel that synthetic fertilizer is sort of a missed opportunity because you're not adding in microbes or you're not adding in? Does that question make sense in terms of, how significant is that impact in terms of that inhibition? I'm curious.
Oh, that's an excellent question. It's something that we've looked at extensively. And here's the marl plots. There was a number of things that came out of the marl plots. Number one is use of synthetics tends to degrade organic matter in soils. Okay, so what happens is we throw a lot of synthetic nitrogen on a plot. It increases selects for a particular set of microbes that basically will consume everything in their path, meaning all your organic matter. So the marl plots found out that high synthetic fertilizer use does degrade your carbon stocks in your soil. And this is a way to get away from the synthetics, to use that microbial action to produce nitrogen and make other nutrients available, and also build your carbon stocks in your soil at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're also looking at, we're looking at creating a more resilient soil and a more resilient system to grow in. I mean, I do feel, especially I grew up in the Northeast, coming out here and growing in Colorado, it feels like a very marginal to be growing vegetables. And I think the soils, you can see in this slide, our soils that are up around 4% organic matter. And then behind it, you can see that plastic mulch where the soil organic matter is 1.5%. And I think, this is a dynamic living system. And we are, one of the ideas behind the no-till thing is like, we're growing all our fertilizer from a 50-pound bag of seed. We're not trucking in, tons of fertilizer from off the farm. And also, this is just like a more pleasant place to be than, the bare ground behind us. And I think it's a more resilient and dynamic system.
Just two things I want to add to that, because Phil made a great point. In terms of pollinators, yeah, the front scenario there with the vetch and everything blooming in it, we're giving those a real boost early on in the season when we don't have a lot of else in bloom. Secondly, on both our conventionally farmed field and Phil's plots, it's interesting to see after a big snow in the spring or a big rain, you'll get water setting in that conventionally tilled and farm part. Phil's cover cropped areas, that water is absorbed, it's put to use, it's stored in the soil profile. And it's a huge difference if you look across the fields in early spring, even with just bare hint of a cover crop coming up, it makes such a huge difference. So it's a win-win all the way around. And yeah, I guess our biggest concern too is synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus are so water soluble that, especially in the Midwest, and any major river in farm country is loaded full of excess nutrients. And I think there's a better way. I'm not saying we should all convert to this system overnight. I think Phil and I both agree it's a lot of work and takes a lot of education. But I think it's a way that we have to go for a lot of good things besides carbon sequestration and nitrogen sequestration and all those issues.
Thanks, Larry and Phil. I've got a couple of questions. One from the Philoli horticulture team, asking you to speak a little bit more about your no-till, minimum till methods, whether you are ever spading or turning in your crops, or are you only crimping? Mo Hemmings is also asking, are you combining any organic fertilizers, fish, kelp, alfalfa, etc., with the selected cover crop and minimum till? So multiple minimum till questions.
Yeah, so this season we kind of compromised, and what we did was, yeah, we crimped down that cover crop, ripped a furrow, and then we actually did some of our, we did a little bit of the chicken manure, the dehydrated poultry waste that we usually do, just to kind of give ourselves, you know, kind of hedge our bets a little bit. And, you know, so for one there, and then what we're doing now is where we're done with, or what we did a little earlier this fall, we went through and mowed down where we were done with our crops, such as our melons and winter squash, mowed that down and then overseeded with a cover crop for next season. And what we did was just we overseeded and then just ran our rototiller over it on a low RPM just to kind of scuff that seed in. So, you know, you will have to break ground, you know, at some point in the cycle just to scuff your seeds in to get the next flush for the next season, which then you can, you know, crimp down and have your mulch there. But yeah, we have been mowing and kind of scuffing things in as well.
And I'd just add to that too that I think we all know no-till and minimum till can be a great thing, especially in terms of water savings. And part of what Dr. Christine Jones advocates too is if we don't disturb the soil profile over time, we develop a real complex microbial and fungal networks that help support plant growth and roots. So that's another further reason minimum or no-till, just to keep from destroying all those hyphae that form under those crops.
And I will also mention, you mentioned the fish fertilizer, all our transplants that go in, everything we did no-till this year, we did as transplants out of the greenhouse. All our transplants get a dose of fish emulsion before they go in the ground. And then we do also have a fertigation system. So we did at maybe monthly intervals, especially on our winter squash and fall brassicas, just because we did see some yellowing in the leaves. We did some periodic applications through the fertigation system of fish emulsion.
Good question.
Thank you both. I believe that is all the online group chat questions. I'd like to thank everyone. We've had a great attendance today to this first Food and Agriculture webinar. It's really great information. Soils are such an exciting and popular topic. We have had wonderful, wonderful response to our soil presentations at the last conferences. So, you know, thanks to all of the soil fans who keep supporting this topic. We're really loving talking about it. I'm going to guess, since I haven't seen any new activity, that we're going to wrap up. Emily Hestness, did you want to make a final statement?
Sure, I'll just say thank you so much to Phil and Larry for your presentation. This was really great, and thanks to everyone for your questions. We want this to be a conversation that continues in this community. So if you have other soil-related topics you'd like us to talk about on future calls, or if you have other thoughts on activities you'd like to see this group engaging in as we kind of learn together more about soil health, please either email me or Larry, or feel free to start some discussion in our online group, and we hope to continue our conversations around soil health that way. So thanks again to everyone for joining, and I think that's all that I've got.